I think that probably now, mind you, if I was, 60, 70 years old, I feel like I have a better sort of interpretation of this. But I think that welcome to Whiskey Wisdom. I'm your host Shaq.
And I'm your host, Nahum.
And so this week we're kicking it old school, back to Whiskey Wisdom origins. Most of you listeners probably hadn't really heard episodes where it was just me and Nahum, but for an extended period of time, um, it was just us. Kind of come on here with a general sort of topic or idea that we encountered during the week that we thought was interesting, and we just like talk through it back and forth, and end up coming out with some relatively interesting viewpoints. So we're just gonna do that. And this week, I was I was on a walk, and one of the thoughts that I was having in my head, because like there are times where I think it's natural to kind of think harder about what you do, right? As far as, is there another level that I can get to? Um, is there another aspect of this that I can explore? Um, or even to the regard of, is this the correct thing that I should be doing? Is there somewhere else that my skill sets could be better utilized, right? And I found an article by the actual BBC. I think it was in 2021 that they wrote this article that was saying why we define ourselves by our jobs. And one of the points that they kind of brought up was that in natural conversation, right, when we're like meeting someone for the first time or introducing ourselves to a group, then sometimes more often than not, we reduce ourselves to what we do, right? I'm Shaq, I am an engineer, or I'm a Nahum and I'm an architect, or I'm whoever and I'm a doctor, or I'm a professor, or I'm a trader, or whatever it is. But it's generally to give someone um, an idea of who we are from like a value perspective, from a um, what drives you kind of perspective. And sometimes it can put you into a box of sorts, right? Because now um, you feel as though you need to operate within a certain way in order to maintain that identity that you have for yourself. But before we get further into the article, as far as why uh, tying yourself so closely to your profession may be more detrimental than beneficial, do you have any initial like thoughts on it, uh, Mr. Caron?
So before we get into it, I think the only one that I will say before we start breaking down the article is I think the emphasis on what you're saying, or what you started to mention, that I think we use it as shorthand, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and there's good and bad for it, as well, but I think it's in a very similar way. And while we will probably be focusing more on career right now, but I think it's shorthand, and there's a significance in that because it's also the same way that we use shorthand for anything else. Um, we live in a world, and here on the podcast, we don't necessarily shy away from talking on different subjects and topics. So um, we've covered gender, sexuality, sex,
Mm-hmm.
the sex, the description of verb or action, um, race, number of different attributes we could say, and I think the the part that we can necessarily, we're gonna focus probably more than ever, or more than anything else on career, on employment, on the job. But I think, just to start, the thing that comes into my mind is this idea that it is shorthand. We use it as shorthand. We use it as like you said, maybe kind of the thing to describe the goals, the route, and everything. But it has benefits and the pitfalls, for when we use shorthand for anything else, and the fact that it can be very enlightening and in some degrees useful and meaningful if Shaq were to describe himself as a black man, or I were to describe myself as a Mexican American, or
Mhm.
a I always forget really because of how people count it, but a first generation here in America, um, or born here in America. Like, we can just as easily say that, but it would be a shorthand.
Mhm.
So it ends up being really a case of like what, understanding that, as we get into the rest of it. And I think there'll be a lot of the breakdowns that when we get into it, we realize how much, of a shorthand, and the different ways that kind of can affect the conversation.
I mean, yeah, I do think that that is a natural point. That's important as well. Is that as people, we look to try to like sort, right? To put people into groups to get a better understanding as far as like what their experience may be. Um, Even we can like self-describe, but uh, experience can obviously vary greatly from person to person. But there's a general kind of streamline that goes through that group that you want to place yourself in, right? So, you know, for example, uh, there are some doctors that are black, that are white, that are Mexican, that are Asian, and um, outside of the profession, their lives may vary greatly. Inside of the profession, there there may be some major kind of things or hurdles as well, but there's a general kind of streamline as far as a like experience of becoming um a physician or a surgeon or anything like that, right? So like there's a general group of shared experiences that they all have. And where I think that the article kind of looks to like point out is um that it may come from a historical kind of sense, so like if you kind of think back to like the Middle Ages, for example, right? We're a family of blacksmiths, or we're a family of carpenters, or of farmers, or et cetera, right? I'm a blacksmith because my pops was, or I'm a farmer because my great great whoever was, right? So I think that, well, okay, let's get into the article. I think the article does a pretty good job of breaking it down from an example kind of perspective too. So one of which was saying that jobs have a significant marker of identity, but in a more, well, in a way that is actually kind of nuanced, right? So when a person says that they are a surgeon, you generally assume that they have a strong education and a high income. Two metrics that can determine one's standing in society and affect how you subsequently judge the person. Of course, this is a two-way street. Some people welcome this judgment because they desire to associate themselves with the wealth and accomplishment that their professional titles imply, right? So, a shortcut to a social kind of hierarchy, right? In the same way, kind of bring back to the Middle Age terms. I'm from royalty. Like, you just kind of fucking say that. And then people are like, oh, okay. So, you uh, see yourself as a high class person. Therefore, you have a general expectation of how you should be treated and how you move in the world and, yada, 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 right? But, is that something that we think are, is a good way to go about social interactions?
Look, the as you were speaking on that, the crazy part of it is I thought about it and I cannot recall Queen Elizabeth's last name. Can't remember whatever the King George when the U.S. succeeded or
Hmm.
gained independence. I can't remember their last name. There has to be something with the effect that they're just royalty, and like you said, you're like, I am royalty. That's what I do.
Hmm.
I suppose there has to be something tied in with the fact that it is their both supposed occupation and the role that they have, and everyone just kind of accepted that. So it's very troll. But in a historic standpoint, and even now, the idea of tying social standing and prestige to it, it is it is conflicting because the idea of just inherently tying to it this social standing, I don't necessarily like it, but I don't know that there's a way that you can separate them. I don't think it's necessarily something that should be just accepted as face value. In the same way that class should not be accepted, class and social standing and economic standing shouldn't be necessarily accepted as the idea of like better. I think better
Hmm.
is a often overused word in that sense, or again also a shorthand, just because a lot of people want to be in a easier or a more comfortable or in a more secure social standing and financial standing, but also you can't divorce any of that from the fact that there is a level of difficulty and a level of respect from reaching one of these professions that are tied to the social standing, to that class um, or that level of prestige. Whether or not everyone could become a like a neurosurgeon if they had the resources and the support to go through all those years of school, um, is definitely a fair reason as to why like we should not necessarily tie some prestige and some um, value to that identity as a because of the job, but also the idea being that it is still a difficult job, and there is a certain amount of respect and a nod that we as a society have kind of given people who reach some of these professions.
Hmm.
you know Both maybe because of interest and because of the effort and the difficulty that they are to reach. And that's not to say that you know a custodian and a neural surgeon have a different, that one is more valuable than the other, that they have a different value to their lives and who they are as people themselves. But I guess as a society, we just have looked at it and we've said, one is not more needed. They are both needed, but one is harder for more people to do.
I mean, yeah. So I think that so I personally believe that there isn't anything wrong with saying what you do, right? Where I think that you get into treacherous territory is when you identify with what you do. So what I mean by that is, to use a quote, from this article as well, which is the enmeshment
Hmm.
kind of trap, right? So basically, if you tie your self worth to your career, the successes and failures you experience will directly affect your self-worth,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like if you're at work and you're having like a rough week, and you just kind of keep fucking things up, things keep going wrong, and if you've tied your identity so closely to your occupation, then you may begin to believe that you're like stupider than you are,
Mm-hmm.
or that you are less deserving of what you have, yada yada yada, right? So like, because there's so many aspects of life that are outside of that occupation, then I think that it's a reductionary sort of perspective to tie your value so closely to your occupation.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting points that the article kind of mentioned as well was that there's certain professions that extend past that timeline of 9 to 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be if you're a lawyer or you're a doctor or an engineer or what have you, that there's going to be times where you're working and it's 9 o'clock at night, or you're
Mm-hmm.
working and it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and if that's how you navigate and live your life, then it's very easy for to consume it,
Yeah.
right? So from a personal kind of perspective, I had the personal goal of trying to be like the best engineer that I could be, right? I want to handle all of these aspects and angles of of like languages to code in, infrastructures to be familiar with, and there's it's the master of none kind of situation, that there's so many fucking things that you can try to spend time on and get better at and do, that if you try to hit them all, then you will have nothing else. Like you will have no time really to pursue any other things, because there's
Mm-hmm.
so many marks to hit, that if you tie your identity with I want to be the best at this one thing and gather all that I can, from this one thing, that usually it's not just a single like facet kind of situation. Like there's so many different things that you can improve on, that you have to be careful as far as how you weigh those things out. So
Mm-hmm.
personally, I had to force myself into doing auxiliary hobbies, dancing, improv,
Yeah.
all these other things that were so far removed from engineering, to remind myself that I'm more than just this.
I can agree with that, and I just yesterday had a conversation with a brother from church who is a mindset that I think you would appreciate, because he it seems like he wants to move, he always wants to improve, he's trying to learn something else so that he can move up and kind of like better himself, better his situation and all that. It's a very hustle mentality,
Mm-hmm.
and it's good. It's good. It keeps us moving. It keeps us healthy. It keeps us getting better and growing. But what I told him is something that I've similarly told you, is that like, look, there is a natural drawback to that, is that because it can become very easy, like you say, to then get encapsulated. In this case, the article says the word they use is
Mm-hmm.
enmeshed into this job in this case, or into that, where it's like, look, at some point, in a very personal way, I've heard it, I was told, and at some point I came to agree with this mentality, that like, I think, both because of a human perspective and actually even a spiritual and a religious perspective, I think you should be trying to do everything you do to the best of your abilities. But it's very easy then, in an occupational mindset, to be it's hyperbolic, but to be killing yourself at work, to be trying to do this better and give all your all and give everything to the company. For what I learned is, at some point, a company that's just going to say, this is the end of the road,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not you were doing well, whether or not there wasn't a reason to necessarily lay me off. There just wasn't work. And then you are left with, like you said, you putting everything into this company per se, and what else do you have? So in that sense, I can definitely agree with this idea that, like, enmeshing yourself, as they say, just fully locking yourself to this profession, has a detrimental effect of taking you from everything else. and,
Right.
and, and kind of then you don't necessarily open yourself to, for me, as someone that you know then personally, and know that I sometimes still do it, putting in all these overtime hours because we got to get the project out, because that's kind of the culture and that's how it is, and the work has to get done, has the issue that, like, then it's all these years later, and I fully recognize, as I've told you, as I've told listeners and family, I fully recognize there's different parts of my life that I have at times neglected or put down. At this age, I frankly could have dated a lot more, because then, as you know, a family is essentially the biggest desire or biggest part of the thing that I've always kind of strived for. And yet, because I have to, in my mind, be in a good position at work and financially stable and all that, then, like, I've been putting all this into work. I'm at this point about to be 30, which is not that old, but if this mentality were to keep for another 10 years, I'd be coming up on 40, 50,
Mhm.
who knows how long. And it's like, okay, Nahum, when do you step away from the identity of the work for all the other things? So
Yeah. Yeah.
that's definitely, I think, the issue. Here is my counter to that, though.
Hmm.
And oddly enough, it's a counter that comes from your life experience, not mine. The counter to that is, I think there is a small group of us as people, as humans, who truly don't have to necessarily make that separation. I think a
Hmm.
lot of us make a compromise, and a lot of us make a settling. We settle for a job and an occupation and stuff that works well enough with what we want and what makes us happy. The counter is the few people who found and do have that opportunity to do necessarily what they love and what is meaningful to them and get paid for it.
Hmm.
And there's two extremes on this. One is, I imagine, I'm going to say a good and actual caring and honest to God politician or activist or something, someone who's working for organizations or charity or something, who is truly believing in their cause and fortunate enough to be, maybe in a nonprofit, but they are getting paid. That is their salary, are
Hmm.
doing something that they truly want and believe in. And so their identity is not necessarily the occupation, whether that's an activist or a politician or any number of other careers or aspirations. Their identity is not necessarily the occupation, but because it's being put into action through the occupation, there is also no way of separating that.
Hmm.
A more down to earth version is the one from your personal life story, which is the story that we often bring up that makes us laugh. And it was one of your first dance instructors.
Hmm.
And it's definitely a much more attainable, or let's say a much more easily reached than position than this kind of like taken care of activist who's getting paid a cushy 9 to 5 salary and all that. But your dance instructor, when you were asking and starting to get to know them and friendly, for all the listeners who may not recall, and even for those who listen, but to just kind of bring it in for this full argument, you were like, oh, okay, cool. So getting to know each other, what do you do after work? Like, what do you do in New York? And,
Hmm.
what's there around to do and all that? She's like, I dance. And you're like, no, no, no. Perhaps you've misunderstood my question. I mean, what do you do when you're done working? And we always laugh at that even she herself looked at you and she's like, I dance.
Yeah,
I
I dance.
I do that for work and I get paid for it. And it's my hobby and my enjoyment and a passion of hers. I'm going to assume that a dance instructor who gets paid to teach people to dance and still chooses to dance as her hobby and after work activity and weekend
Hmm.
activity is doing it because she genuinely enjoys it and that is her passion. She is perhaps maybe at that point she's not a dance instructor. Maybe it would not be correct to call her a dance instructor as her identity. Um, but you could just as easily call a dance instructor a dancer,
Hmm.
and that is her identity. Outside of work, she is a dancer. That is her, and she might have other things she cares about, but her true passion and what she wants to do is to dance.
I mean, yeah, yeah. I think I think that yes, to your point, as far as the small subset of folks that um, have the opportunity um, to like do what they do from a hobby perspective, but also a professional perspective as well, right? And I think that that's um, what a lot of folks dream of being able to do. Quote the idea of having your dream job
Yeah.
or like whatever it is, right? Um,
And listen,
but
at that point, it's totally fair if you're like, Nahum, fuck off. Like, most of us don't get to do that. Let's get back to the actual, like, the
yeah,
topic at hand, which is like the article can recognize the fact that some of us
hmm
have the dream job. Sure, it can be our identity and our occupation. You know, getting back to then the majority of us, it's fair enough that I can take that criticism and be like, okay, fair enough. Let's talk about the rest of us suckers who can maybe enjoy our job but don't feel that same
yeah. I think
passion.
so. So I think that um, there's certain aspects of anything that we can find enjoyment and a feeling of progression in, right? That regardless of job title, that there are some aspects of that job that we enjoy,
Hmm.
right? Like, I don't think that there's a significant amount of jobs that have zero overlap from a skill set kind of perspective,
Mm.
right? Like, there's, probably some like sociability, probably some mechanical nature to it. Um, like there's you can usually reduce it down to something that's consistent with that other thing that you would like to do.
Hmm.
And that's where I think that the idea of an enmeshment tribe gets interesting. That when you, how do I want to say it? When you redefine what you do in such a way to, yeah, this is really kind of pushing my my conceptualization as far as what jobs can be, right? So, like, for example, to bring up the article again, there's a quote that says, and because we live in a society where careers are less likely to be lifelong, if we switch or find ourselves out of a job, it can become an identity crisis.
Hmm.
um, that um, inevitably something will happen. There will be layoffs, a recession, your company will be acquired, and then suddenly your job isn't what it used to be.
Hmm.
It becomes really existential for some people, and they have poor coping strategies because it's earth shattering. So it becomes depression, anxiety, and even substance abuse.
Hmm.
So, if I may ask you this, what I think of initially, right, was that time where you were like in between jobs, right?
Hmm.
Did you have, or did you ever have this sort of like thought process while you were in that state, or did everything just kind of seem smooth? It's like I'm gonna get back to it. Like, it's just a matter of time.
Of identity crisis, I don't feel like I did.
Okay.
What I did have at that time was um, more a crisis of, or a concern, I would say, because I didn't even feel super pressed. As I've said multiple times, I was fortunate and I was able to save beforehand, and I was blessed because of the support I had from my parents. So I had time, and I felt like I had the time to let it breathe and get that. In identity crisis, I didn't feel like I had it, and part of that might be because I was looking. The next job I was looking for was the same role. I
Hmm.
didn't really stop to like, should I do something else? I didn't necessarily even stop to at that time, because I hadn't been working professionally for a very long time. It was very early in my like post college professional career, so I didn't even stop at that time and consider whether or not this was an opportunity for me of being like, Nahum, go back to school now,
Hmm.
or go either for the engineering, which is something that I think of now, or for architecture. Because sometimes we get concerned with the day to day life and meeting the day to day needs, financial and other responsibilities and such. I didn't necessarily stop to think, but frankly, the interesting part is that as we have this discussion, it makes me think and makes me realize that would have been a perhaps fruitful time to have the identity crisis, because perhaps at that time then I would have gone back to school for my architecture masters, or maybe at that time I would have gone back to school for my engineering masters, and things would have been different now. um, in that sense, it is an interesting conversation to have and an interesting question for you of like what now it brings in my head. But personally, I didn't have the identity crisis. I don't think, because of different reasons and different things that like I've shared with the podcast and you, I don't think my identity, my wishes, my goals, my aspirations have ever necessarily been tied specifically with the job. It is just
Hmm.
something that I enjoy. I think my identity has been tied more, if I may say so, even the fact that I don't have it. I think my identity and what I've always considered myself has always been more of a family man, even without the family that I picture having one day. But it was always tied to either the family I had or the family in the future. And the job was always a tool that the family man used. And so in my identity is always a little bit more tied to that idea of a family man, of trying to be a good man. And and I think because of that, it made it easy in that moment for it to be very consistent. Um, one thing that I'll also quickly add is, we were reading and you were listening through that sentence that the article has, and it's crazy to think about because, it lists something like being laid off, company being acquired, or or any number of reasons that like a job could kind of come to an end. Something that doesn't necessarily get brought in that sentence, of inevitably something happening, could be both the good or the bad of like your job just changes or you get promoted. That
Hmm.
conversation I had with the brother at church yesterday, um, was we were talking about how he is a worker now, and like an on the line worker at a place that makes salsas, and the boss, you know, doesn't necessarily now think of or share the same viewpoints or think in the same way as his workers. And I turned to him and I was like, the thing is, the boss is the boss now, and his mentality has changed. And then the jokes that I kind of make with the family is like, money changed, y'all, and we've forgotten all of a sudden some of the things like, the boss doesn't really have the mindset of how some of the things are best done because he's not in the trenches anymore. That man has changed.
Hmm.
And some might say for the better, or he's saying like he's got other issues and other concerns, but it's inherently a change, and maybe he's not suffering for it per se. But yeah, like our life and our occupation and stuff can change even when it's not lost. It's just kind of evolved. And all of a sudden you can find yourself being like, I was a grunt worker. I'm good at being a grunt worker. Now I'm a manager, and I can't I can't manage. I don't feel like this is something I'm happy with,
Hmm.
or I don't like it. And that's an identity change that can also then similarly affect the person. I
Um,
guess in that sense, I'm cheating because, yeah, no, the
well,
work wasn't tied to my identity.
huh. I mean, I think so I like the direction that the conversation's going, right? I think that the article is a little more negative than positive. I think that um enmeshment isn't necessarily a bad thing, but only under a particular sort of scope. Okay. That if the enmeshment remains true to your identity in that phase of your life, then I think that everything is okay. I think that if there's a disconnect between the phase of your life that you're in and holding on to prior um, enmeshment
Yeah.
is where you get that pain. There's this quote that it reminds me of, which I think it's pain um, is wanting reality to be different than what it is. So the premise that like I've been a lawyer for 20 years, okay, and internally, I don't want to fucking do this shit no more. Like I want to go sip and paint, or I want to go, um, be an author or like some other shit. But I feel so enmeshed into what I have done that that uprooting of becoming something different is too spooky.
Yeah.
Right. So I would rather just invest more in this thing that I know and try to convince myself to come back to this thing. Um, that um, that's where that pain comes from. Because I think that when you're in it and it's something that you truly enjoy, the ups and downs are just a part of it for you. You're like, hey, fuck it. It was a rough one today, but we go again tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And those ebbs and flows don't hit as hard because you're enjoying it.
Yeah.
But when that enjoyment leaves, is when the is when the lefts and the rights start to really take the wind up out of you,
Yeah.
because that backing isn't there anymore, because your intuition is telling you to be elsewhere,
Mm-hmm.
but you're still in this thing.
In a very sense that the enmeshment and it's not. I'd have to read the rest of the article, but the enmeshment. I can definitely agree with you. The enmeshment at that point is enmeshment is just the actual word for things that are like inherently tied very together.
Mm-hmm.
But now at that point, the enmeshment is a trap, very much like a mesh. Think like Finding Nemo, nets
Right.
catching you, where like you can't get out of it. And when, like you said, if you're enjoying it, if you like what you're doing, that is still your passion. Then the ups and downs, the struggles on it are challenges, yes. But when you overcome them, or even when you fail, when you're past them, they are milestones that you enjoy. Because we have to meet a quota. Hello, Evan. How are you doing? I am sure Jordan looks at flu game and the way we talk about flu game now, and it's just kind of like an enjoyable of like I did that, that was me, and
Yeah.
there's some pride and some awe with it, even from other people and himself, and it's just like it's an awesome milestone, in his career, that I'm sure he did enjoy, and that was his passion. Like flu game is called flu game. The man had 82 games a season plus
Mm-hmm.
postseason and all that, and he had his games in postseason, and there's multiple that we do call out, but flu game is a specific one that a lot of us can
Yeah.
go in and just and like you said, like that is a hurdle and a challenge, that it's just a valley, or a mountain, depending on however you want to look at the analogy, but it is something that was overcome, and it ends up being a something that is not, it's not a trapping feeling. I also think you were starting to get somewhere where, I don't know if you've maybe thought about it before, but it'd be very fitting because it came from your mouth, and it's actually one of the images that we put up not too long ago. Um, we said something vaguely similar on our episode with Josh about soulmates,
Mm-hmm.
and um, there were still difference in opinions and all that stuff, and the whole question about do you believe in soulmates, but one line that you said that has inklings of this, and kind of um, answers a part of the soulmate question was, please correct me if I get it too far off, but something along the lines of like your soulmate kind of depends on where you are in life.
Hmm.
and how that identity in life. And I think it is a very perhaps similar thing. And I was kind of understanding that, and that was coming to mind as you mentioned it. Some of your former words were like your identity may be changing as you grow,
Hmm.
and then for different reasons, if it is kind of tied to your job, if your identity changes, and now that enmeshment becomes that trapping feeling, if it's no
Right.
longer, you know um, it's no longer complementary to the stuff that you're doing. And I think, kind of like you said, that you need to be able to, your reality and the pain and all that, like it has to constantly be meshing. It has, in the positive sense of enmeshment, but it has to constantly be complementing each other. Otherwise, the mesh doesn't feel like a bond; it feels like a trap.
Right.
And if it's work, that maybe can be easier when you switch from one work to another. Um, if it's a life thing, kind of like myself, or I see it a lot where there's like different memes, or there's conversations about it where you see on Twitter and people put their bio stuff, like the little signature, and a lot of them, can't remember which president it is, but like a former president does not have former president as number one. They have I think like father.
Hmm.
And I can totally understand it if someone is, living their lives and they were fully enmeshed in their work, and that was the priority in their life at the time. And then at some point, the family or the fatherhood comes up, and suddenly it's, maybe not suddenly, but there's a snap and there's a change, and that enmeshment is now tied to a different role, different identity,
Hmm.
um, which does make it a challenge when, if you still have to kind of be living that job, doing that 9 to 5, when now you identify with something else more. Um, but I guess at that point, we just hope that you have that priority, or you have that enmeshment with that other thing, and then the work becomes something that you kind of almost do on the side, like we do a lot of our other hobbies that we enjoy and that we do, and that there's a benefit, but they aren't the core of our fundamental being.
I mean, yeah, I think that's why I initially struggled so hard to like get a foothold on it, because um I in my core believe that having some sort of purpose
Hmm.
is the most necessary thing for a human to have.
Hmm.
That there has to be something for you to point toward, for you to feel alive. And um, I think that there's a natural hierarchy that sorts itself within you for what you should be focusing on at certain points. That
Hmm.
like and those things can change. Humans aren't just like static beings. I think that we try to believe that we are for the sake of simplicity and for a false sense of security. But in reality, we're very dynamic.
Hmm.
Um, there's going to be influences that happen at particular points that may completely shift your mindset on something. There's going to be um, things that happen that may, alter your perception of reality or existentialism, and really kind of change the way that you view life, in totality. And those changes aren't necessarily bad things.
Hmm.
Um, you know, some influences may be worse than others, for sure, right? If you go from, um, doing something that you really enjoy and making a significant amount of money, or affecting a significant amount of people, and then, a poor life event happens and you start to get enmeshed into some self-destructive behaviors, then that may not be like for the best, right? So we can't just blank statement say, Yeah, whatever you get enmeshed in
We
is
can't just be like match up
right.
what you're doing with what you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but I do believe that there is a natural wisdom that we all have internally that we choose to listen to or not. And that if you hear it and
His
you
name is
ignore
Jiminy
it,
Cricket.
Big Jiminy,
Check.
just keep whispering in your ear and shit. Yeah, for sure. Um, but, but, but if you choose to listen to it, or rather, if you hear it and you choose to ignore it, then I think it just gets louder. I don't think that it ever dulls. I think you always feel it. So like if there's something that's telling you, hey, you should be somewhere else. Like this isn't
This is not.
the correct play for you. And internally you're like, no, no, that's fine. Okay, we can just keep moving. Just keep moving. And um, until that voice is satisfied, I don't think it goes away. Um, and that's when, yeah, as we said, that like disconnect happens, and then you start to feel trapped rather than alive.
Mm-hmm.
Because, um, you know, for me, for example, um, there's a new aspect of my job that I just learned about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Last week. And there's been times where I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning thinking about, okay, how can I integrate this into the shit that I do, right? Just excited. Just no reason for me to fucking be awake at 4 o'clock in the morning. Zero reasoning. But the idea of, trying to implement this thing, seeing if it works, is just too it's just too fun to just
Mm-hmm.
try to go back to sleep until I see. And um and I think that we all have something like that. I think that that isn't something that's just uniquely reserved for certain people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we all have something that gets us giddy. Um, and the retort's going to be, well, Shaq, not everything makes money, right? You got kind of lucky that you have something that you get giddy about that is also, you know, um, like kind of sought after.
Yeah.
Fair, right? But to what you were saying, then you have to, well, one, either try to think about ways to, potentially monetize that thing that, you haven't made a good amount of money from,
Mm-hmm.
or two, have a job, but feed the thing that you want to be enmeshed in.
Right.
So, okay, if
And,
you, yeah, yeah.
what just as the very quick thing when and like listen for our listeners, for ourselves, just like there we have a full understanding that obviously we say that and we think it is important, also realizing it's so much easier said than done. The idea of having a job for the money and income while still trying to feed what is your identity is a challenge, because you got 8 hours to sleep, 8 hours to work. You have 8 hours left for what is supposed to be your life,
Mhm.
your life, both with like life admin, showering, eating, grocery, all that stuff, but also with what we're talking about now, which is this kind of this identity and this purpose and this drive that you have, and you have to share that with all your other life things instead of being able to do it for 8 hours and get paid. So I mean, we understand that it is definitely easier said than done, but I mean, yeah, it's a challenge because, like you said, you either find a way to make money of it, or you have to find a way of still getting that identity and that happiness with it, even with it not being a 9 to 5, you're getting paid for it thing.
I mean, yeah, because the voice ain't going away. I hate to say it, um, but that I don't think that natural intelligence um, is reasonable. I think that when it's satisfied, then you'll be okay. Like I'm, content, and um, and if you feel like you're moving, further into what that purpose is, whether it be um, spending time with your family, raising your kids, um, or pursuing a particular hobby, or travel, or whatever it may be, right? That time spent into things that make you feel alive, I don't think is ever poorly time spent.
Mm-hmm.
And getting enmeshed in those things to truly lose yourself in that process, I don't think is ever a poor decision unless it's
Mm-hmm.
a poor process. Um, but regardless, yeah, I think that to kind of bring it back, the article is a bit defeatist, um, but it's also true that in
Right.
the case that you know that you don't see yourself being able to pursue what you want to pursue, then you may try to tie yourself to something that you previously enjoyed pursuing, or maybe you never enjoyed, and then you try to find some sort of thing to kind of grab onto with it. Um, and then when something happens in that situation, then it can become an identity crisis because internally you kind of knew that that thing isn't what you were supposed to be doing in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I have a slight branching question for you,
mm,
based on what you kind of had earlier. The comment of just kind of how we were talking about the natural idea of that, like, identity changes through time, and how we're saying how it kind of has to match up for you're able to be okay, and then happiness with it, and how you mentioned how humans just are by nature very dynamic beings. Do you think, um, you know, in your opinion, or just like off the cuff, nothing too set or holding you to, but how many times would you think throughout one's lifetime that enmeshment, that identity, do you think ends up changing, and how many do you think you've gone through already? And particularly because you said we're very dynamic, and I think it you know I think you're right. I sat here and I said that my identity has been pretty the same, and through high school and all that, it's been more about family and family man, and being able to get to that, with all of it being a tool, or a a path to that. And even if that is correct, and even if I can sit here and say that is still true, and think it anyways, that doesn't mean that I always gave the end goal the same weight as what I was doing at the moment. So during college, yes, it was for that end goal, but my identity was not family man, it was then student.
mm,
Even if it was for that purpose, but it was a very student, let's do this now. And it didn't even make sense because I didn't date for the purpose of, I need to do the schooling and this working. I need to hammer it out now, and I need to do it well enough, even if I could have done better, but I need to do it well enough. So I need to focus on this. And in that sense, yeah, I mean, it throws my own words back at me because my identity was not to have or to even be that close with my family at the time, I definitely dedicated more to the schooling.
So I think that probably now, mind you, if I was 60, 70 years old, I feel like I have a better sort of interpretation of this. But I think that minimally, probably twice per decade, I think that there's major shifts from an identity perspective,
Okay.
right? So, let's say age 10 to 15, age 15 to 20, 20 to 25, 25 to 30, right? That like in those marks, that there's two major purpose shifts that happen.
Hmm.
Okay. Let's say that, you're in your 20s, early 20s, you're still in college, you're in the like student phase still, right? I'm just trying to get the fuck up out of here and like try to get my first job. I'm not thinking about no family, I'm not thinking about getting no house, I'm not thinking about getting no car, assets, investments, none of that shit, right? You get 25, okay. I'm trying to get like some
Maybe on the mind, but I'm just trying to survive right now.
I'm just, now that I'm out here in the real world, um, I'm trying to make a good buck. Maybe I'm living alone. We're just trying to sustain, okay? Or maybe you're just trying to have fun still, right? You're just like, hey, I'm still in my 20s. Fuck it, we just gonna let it ride. You know what I'm saying? See what happens, right?
I'm on my own and I have money now.
Yeah. And then you hit 30s, and 30s, mid 30s, 40s, 40, whatever. So I would say minimally twice per decade that there's um some internal check-in. Sure, there's some societal pressures that are tied to that. As far as should I be doing this at this point in my life, right? Um, but I think that there's so many things as far as lessons that you pick up over the course of 5 years that I would be impressed if none of your thoughts or actions have changed um, in a 5 year span.
Now, here is, I think I can agree with that, and especially with our lives so far.
Sure.
But then because of that, I also expect more at the beginning or towards the beginning of life.
That just kind of front loaded, yeah.
And then once, like, let's say, because my initial thought for like how many was not necessarily a per decade or per years, but maybe more by like milestones or
Sure.
stages of life, which ends up being pretty damn similar because it just naturally works that way with time. Um, but then I feel like to a certain extent that makes me think then, or that thought process for me was that, okay, about 30-ish, 30 to 35 maybe, keeping it with that decade thing, you have potentially, I'd say, after like 30-ish, you got like four left. Four,
In totality?
potentially, like four left in totality. And it's kind of like, it's sort of, because in my head, at least, I was thinking in a milestone perspective, it's kind of more of like, you know, let's say 30-ish, you're a young adult, one would hope, or we're trying to, at least, often hustling to get to that point, but like young adult, still adult, but relatively young, and you're now kind of established. You get one more if you're someone who decides to get married and kind of now um, be with someone, very tied with someone. You get another one when it's kind of more about parenthood and family now, and it becomes very, very um, much as a parent, and a part of me kind of feels like that kind of gets locked for quite some time. Um, and then maybe another one in my experience as a child, mind you, or as a child, a grown person, but as the son of parents. As a son on my end of it, it's that okay, you are kind of this family and raising and kids and all that until you get to a point where you're an adult. Children, your children are adults. There's a new kind of phase in that relationship. Um, and mind you, mine's is very family heavy in the mentality, but then, you know, I think of it that way because I think just in general that idea of then having and raising kids and all that locks you to a certain extent. And you yourself go through changes, but I feel that a lot of parents would tell you the priorities and the thoughts are on the children, and that
Mhm.
is the locking thing. So now
That's
you
right.
get the opportunity for when they're adults. Now you get to have a relationship. You get to have an adult relationship with an adult child, and they are still your children, but the relationship naturally changes. So that means your identity changes a little bit. Even though most parents are still like, they are still parenting, they're always parents, but it does change some.